I hope everyone enjoyed all the fun, fair food for the day. And we're going to talk about something that gets asked to us all the time, and that is
Boilerplate!
it has been yelled across the lands about the biggest problem with NgRx. It's the boilerplate.
I have talked to people have talked to me on Twitter, and I have blocked them for mentioning boilerplate. So watch it. You say boilerplate, you're getting blocked.
So here's what we're going to do. We're going to tell you what boilerplate actually is. Then we're going to tell you some steps to reduce the real boilerplate in your application. And then we're going to show a little bit of the future of NgRx at the end. So you've seen this slide today already, and I want to go over it again. Clarity over brevity. This is the driving force for NgRx. Spend time up front by being very explicit about how state changes in your application and how side effects start. If you do this, our assertion is that this will help you write more maintainable programs.
Also, NgRx is an architecture. NgRx is all about giving you tools to write explicit applications that are easy to trace. We want to avoid abstractions that introduce implicitness.
So Brandon, does this mean if I use NgRx, my application will become easier to reason about and I will win?
Of course.
No.
Not really. Introducing NgRx into your app does not automatically make it easier to reason about, in quotes.
Note that we want developers to reduce the boilerplate without writing abstractions that are going to remove some of the benefits that NgRx gives you. So where does this boilerplate come from? Why is this explicitness important? Well, to do that, we kind of have to take a 10,000-foot view at this NgRx thing one more time. And I'm sure you've seen this diagram a couple of times, but it's worth mentioning again.
So, of course, store follows the Redux pattern. Components normalize UI events into actions that represent a logical change in state.
When an action is dispatched, a special reducer function gets to decide how state transitions as a result of that action.
State is also delivered to components through an observable and operators.
And this allows you to write state changes in a way that is immutable and pushes data to your UI with an observable. What benefits does this yield you? Well, the first is serializability.
And that allows you to inspect, download, upload, and dispatch all these actions that in time travel integrated with the dev tools.
It allows you to transmit actions over a WebSocket connection or to a web worker.
You can also save your state to local storage or any external browser storage, whether you're doing this on a mobile device or whether you're doing server-side rendering.
It also gives you immutability. This lets you turn on push change detection in a large majority of your application, giving you a tremendous performance boost so that change detection only really happens when your state's updated.
So you can get a guarantee that the responsibility of where those state changes happen is in your reducers.
It's also all about type safety. We write so much of NgRx the way we've written it so that your applications that you write will be as type safe as possible.
Actions are written this way so that you can share these action type constraints and interfaces across your application without breaking lazy loading.
We write reducers the way they are written so the TypeScript compiler can infer the shape of actions that enter your case statements.
Selector functions, which are pure, select pieces of state and allow that type safety to flow from your state to your components.
It's also going to let you leverage type inference where possible. This means we're trying to do as much as possible so the TypeScript compiler can understand your program without you having to write type annotations everywhere. Because we want you to be able to verify the correctness of your program. Another benefit is that it's going to make testing less painful.
And if you watched our talk earlier about testing with NgRx, you notice we use a lot of functions. Selectors, action factories, and reducers are all pure functions.
This allows you to avoid dependency injection in the majority of an NgRx application. We push developers to keep side effects where they belong and isolated NgRx effects so that testing the rest of your application is straightforward. And yet, despite all these great guarantees and benefits that we give you, you still say to us,
Boilerplate! Boilerplate!
Okay. So, what are our goals for reducing the boilerplate then? Well, we don't want to ruin what makes NgRx awesome. We don't want to make your application less serializable, less type safe. We don't want to make it harder to test. These are the cornerstones of NgRx, and so we don't want to ruin what makes NgRx awesome.
We don't want to introduce magic. And as we mentioned before, this is implicitness, which makes it harder to debug your application in the long run, because you don't just ship and leave it alone forever.
And most importantly, we want to give you, the developers, the flexibility to build on top of NgRx to suit your needs. If you want to introduce conventions into your application that might hide some of this complexity for you, you have really good building blocks to do so. And so before we get into this boilerplate problem, I love pulling out this quote because it just hits the nail on the head.
Am I going to have to block you on stage?
Nope.
Okay.
Redux is not great for making simple things quickly. It's great for making really hard things simple. There is a cost to NgRx. You're not going to be able to move as fast with it. But it's going to make your really hard problems so much easier to solve with NgRx. All right, let's do it. Let's solve the boilerplate problem.
Yes.
But first, what is boilerplate? Well, when you build a feature, there are a few things that you're going to need. At a minimum, you're going to need actions to describe events, reducers to manage state changes, and selectors to retrieve pieces of state. But boilerplate has a very important definition. Boilerplate is any code that you have to repeat throughout your code base with little to no alteration. And so I'm really sorry to report that actions and reducers are not boilerplate. Yeah! They get it in the back.
That guy.
So why is this, Brandon? Why are these not boilerplate?
So actions describe unique events that happen throughout your application.
This means this is not code that you're repeating with no alteration. These are all unique pieces of code. There's just a lot of them.
Reducers are where the business logic happens for your state updates and handle those unique actions that I just mentioned.
And so these building blocks, we get it. They take a lot of time to write, and there's a lot of them. But this isn't boilerplate. That's just explicitness. And it's that explicitness that enables immutability, type safety, serializability, and testability. We're going to keep saying those words throughout this talk. So then what is the boilerplate that we could actually reduce?
Actual boilerplate? Yes. Actual boilerplate is things like connecting the reducers to the store. Also registering effects, whether you're doing this at the root or you're registering the effects lazily, you're still doing the same thing over and over.
With just very minimal changes, right? So this is real boilerplate. It's also handling common state shapes. Handling collections of entities, for example, is got some very common patterns throughout it. So what are some strategies for reducing all of this boilerplate that is in an NgRx application?
Now we're going to cover these strategies, and we're going to cover making the right decisions about what goes in the store and what doesn't.
We're also going to talk about NgRx schematics, which you're going to hear about throughout the day. And that allows you to automate some of those common boilerplate tasks that help you generate some of the required infrastructure for writing an NgRx application.
With using common state shapes, we're going to talk about using NgRx entity to manage collections. And one thing we're really excited about is to talk about the future and what's going to happen in future versions of NgRx.
So first, the easiest way to reduce the boilerplate is to write less code. And you can write less code by putting fewer things in the store. So let's talk about some things that belong in your store and what doesn't. To do this, we have a simple mnemonic called Sherry. You can follow the Sherry principle to determine what state does belong in your store.
So if we go through the first one in the Sherry principle, it is shared state.
So shared state is accessed by any components or services. This means that it's state that is not just consumed by one consumer.
If you saw my authentication talk yesterday, I hinted at this, that authentication is a great example of shared state. Because that state is, you need to share it throughout your application, and it gets changed from different places. And many pages and services need to access it.
The second principle of Sherry is state that is hydrated. This is state that needs to be persisted and hydrated either in local storage or session storage, as in you need it to be available to your application the next time it boots up.
User preferences is a good example of this. that need to be persisted and hydrated across page reloads and navigation.
That way, when your app starts back up, user preferences can be restored or hydrated from your session storage strategy. The third principle of Sherry is state that needs to be available when re-entering routes.
So this is state, of course, when you're navigating around, you don't want to have to go and reach back or to hit external APIs to reload that data. And so that data is always there, available, ready to consume.
For instance, if a user starts going through a workflow on a page, like a wizard, then leaves the page, it might be useful to keep that state in the store so that when they come back to that page, it's still available to those components.
There's state that needs to be retrieved with a side effect. And this is where you interact through external APIs to get that data. And this is data that keeps those interactions separate from your components and that state that you have there.
For example, if a user can initiate a search on a collection and that search needs to happen with a REST API request, then it makes sense to build the search feature with the NgRx architecture because it's going to enable you to isolate that side effect and leverage the store to keep your components and your components pure. Finally, state that is impacted by other actions or sources.
Put state in the store that is changed from other components or services.
So as you're building an NgRx application, always think of Sherry. State that is shared, hydrated, that needs to be made available, or is retrieved from a side effect, and lastly, state that is impacted from other sources. So what doesn't belong in the store then?
Forms!
That's right. I know the talk we're following up gave you another perspective, and it's kind of a controversial thing. Some developers want to do it, others don't. But we kind of feel that you shouldn't keep form state because it's also non-serializable, and any state that's non-serializable probably doesn't belong in the store. So, forms don't belong in the store. Why is that?
Because forms are full of stateful information that's usually self-contained in a local context.
The Angular form controls aren't serializable or immutable. They're going to change themselves, and you aren't going to be able to track that with actions. And in a way, the reactive forms module is kind of its own state management library in itself, made specifically for forms. It handles all of the common form state for any control, like touched and value and validity. It also connects side effects to changes in controls with async validators. It gives you events to hook into that are relevant to the content of building forms.
These are strategies for connecting state to the store. There are strategies for connecting state to the store to forms that are more compelling than doing this within NgRx.
We also want to keep unserializable state out of the store. This is any state that has cycles in it or has an instance of complex data structures. Those don't belong in the store. We can't serialize those, and so we can't leverage serializability in our application.
And since serializability is a big cornerstone of how you build an NgRx app, we don't want to include, we want you to follow these rules so that it helps you with debugging and state hydration.
This means we can't use some utility data structures like maps or sets. They're not serializable, and so we shouldn't use them in our reducer functions.
One quick note, because we've seen this a lot. The router state is a good example of this, because the router state is complex, it has cycles, and these are things that you don't necessarily need that full picture of. So something like that would be a good example of things that you wouldn't keep in the store or that you would pare down if you needed to access that data.
Lastly, keep any state that is solely owned by a component out of the store. You do not need to put all of your application state in the store. Only state that follows the Sherry principle.
It's okay to have component with this local state that gets cleaned up because as we've seen, people that use NgRx want to tend to put everything there. And by following these principles, you'll be able to make better decisions about what goes in there.
The second strategy for reducing the boilerplate is schematics, and I'm going to let Brandon walk us through this one.
So schematics is a scaffolding library for NgRx, of course, if you're unfamiliar with it. It provides automation for these repetitive tasks, like we mentioned, that aren't unique, in addition to generating a lot of the things that you do use with the NgRx, including actions, reducers, and effects. when you're building out your app. NgRx schematics works with the CLI, so there's already that integration there when you want to handle what is actual boilerplate, as we talked about earlier. And this is done with this integration that uses code and templates to generate files. And if you saw this talk earlier about NgRx schematics, then you may be a little familiar with how that works.
Brandon, can I use NgRx schematics with the default schematics that are available in Angular CLI?
Yes, you can. You can set your NgRx schematics to be the default so that you don't have to specify specific collections when using the CLI with your app. And this was covered a little bit in the previous talk about NgRx schematics, but it is one thing that needs to be mentioned. So the things that, if you're starting to integrate NgRx into your project, we provide helpers with that to generate a new store. Or if you're already using NgRx, as I mentioned, there are these core principles that you need to generate. And this helps you get along quickly with what you need to do and not have to focus on those things. And as we mentioned, those things are actions to describe events, reducers to handle those state changes, and effects for handling side effects. So if you're already using that, then there are a few things you can take advantage of that we'll also cover in a little bit. The first one being entity. This is where you generate a collection to handle common shapes that we talked about. The biggest one is a feature, and that is where you can generate an action, a reducer, and an effect. And being integrated with the CLI, you can wire these up to your modules and not have to worry about how all the machinery works and let you get going in that case. There's also a container blueprint. And as we've mentioned throughout the talks today, container is basically just a pre-wired component that has store already injected to it. Because these are where your smart components are going to be as opposed to your presentation components. So with that being said, how does this help you with the boilerplate? We register feature states. Those are things that are going to be the same and are not unique, whether you're doing them as upfront or when you're adding new functionality. We help you wire up effects, which, like I said, handle side effects. And we have integration with ng modules. Schematics helps you handle this area that is boilerplate so you can help build your app more efficiently.
All right, show me how it works then. So I have a question for you, Brandon, while you're getting this set up. Is this going to follow the best practices, or is it more like the example app and kind of helps you learn?
The schematics follow, well, it does a little bit of both. Schematics follow the best practices that we implement that you should use as far as the structure that you should have, and also gives you those conveniences of how you go about generating that information. So here, I've aptly now created a project called NgRx Boilerplate, of course, because y'all love it. And here, I'm just going to show a few things. I'm going to show, starting from scratch, how quickly I could get integrated with NgRx in my app. So if I use the ng-generate function and generate a store and give it a name and tell it where it's going to be registered, you can see that it's set up my initial reducers for me and also registered that within the app module. So these are things that I got started with NgRx and I didn't even have to worry about. I set up my reducers, integrates with the dev tools, and register those imports automatically. If we take a quick look inside the reducer function, or reducer file, sorry, we have our interface that defines our states, our action reducers, and meta reducers that operate on the store also. So that's one example of using schematics to get started quickly with NgRx. Next, I'll generate a feature that helps you to move along if you're already using NgRx and generate an action, reducer, and effect. So I use the ng-generate feature, and I'm going to call this one users. And we'll talk a little bit further about how entity plays into this picture. So I'm generating the files that I need, actions, reducer, and effects, and I already wired it up to my reducers file. So if we look in here, I have a user's property, and it's already wired up to my reducer. And if I look in the users folder, I have actions, and we've already set up the best practices that we have to give to you about how you use NgRx and how you define actions.
Hey, Brandon, that action type doesn't follow good action hygiene. Can you change that?
That's a good catch, Mike, and you're going to fix that, right?
Yes.
But it's just to give you an example of how you can get going quickly and how you can make these actions more specific so that you can follow good action hygiene.
The important part is that it just scaffolds this out and connects it for you. You're still responsible for writing the NgRx application and following or building out the rest of the logic.
If we look at effects, we can see that I've already predefined the user actions to help you get going with loading new data or building out a new feature. Lastly, we have the reducer that's generated that has the switch statement that people love, especially me, to get going quickly and be able to build out those state transitions. And Mike is going to he's going to take a good deep dive into reducer functions when he talks about entity.
So NgRx schematics puts you on the right path for generating out and connecting these reducers. From there, you write out the part of the application that's most interesting, the part that's unique about the application you're building. And that's the actions and the way state changes and the effects that start. This tool really helps you scaffold out the real boilerplate that exists in an NgRx application. Boilerplate. Don't block me.
Don't block me, bro. Next, Mike is going to talk about NgRx entity, which also helps you handle those common state shapes we mentioned earlier.
So with NgRx entity, it gives you a couple of things. It's a set of helpers to help you manage collections. And it does this by providing you a set of type-safe functions for handling common operations, like creating, reading, updating, or deleting items out of a set. It is built as an extendable type-safe adapter that you can use to build more powerful domain-specific adapters with. And this type-safe adapter is a really good building block. It helps you build your own adapters that meet your requirements. So what does this adapter do? Well, like I said, it's kind of built on this idea that applications tend to want to manage collections in their application. And with a collection, there's really a number of things that I, as a UI developer, want to do with them. I want to know how many items are in a collection. For instance, I might want to show the length of the collection or the size of it somewhere in my UI. I also might want to get one item out of that collection. Maybe I'm building a details page where I can view one item at a time, and I need it to be fast. I also want to build lists. I want to show every item in my collection using like an ng-for. And I want to be able to manage this collection in a reducer function. But as we said, this is difficult because some of the really nice JavaScript data types that exist in the language we can't use in a reducer function, like maps or sets, because they're not serializable. And so to do this, we need to be able to update the collection as fast as possible while still preserving our 3 use cases.
Hey, Mike, am I still following good practices by using this?
Absolutely. NgRx entity puts you on the right rails for building fast reactive applications. And this is going to help you query items out of that collection. It's going to help you query all of them. It's going to help you get the total size of it. And so What it's going to do is we're going to take all of the actions that come through our NgRx application. We're going to pass it to the reducer, and this reducer is going to use NgRx entity to update state. And what does this state look like? Well, if we can't use maps or sets, then we need to pick a data structure that's going to be serializable, but also really fast. And that's called the entity state. The IDs property allows us to maintain the sort order of the collection. Remember that objects do not necessarily preserve sort order for their keys. So if you want to sort your collection, or if you want to maintain the sort order from your REST API, that's what the IDs property lets you do.
Mike, how is it fast? Is it really fast?
It's very fast. And the fast or the speed comes from the entities property. This allows you to reference a single item extremely quickly. We don't have to search through an array for an item. We can just quickly look it up using a hash table by its ID. This is helpful when we need to update a single item, test for an existence of an item, or display one item, and do it reasonably quickly. But this data structure is really hard to work with if you're going to do it by hand.
This looks like boilerplate.
It kind of is the boilerplate because this state shape appears in so many places in your NgRx application. And so we want to reduce the boilerplate of managing it. This is where NgRx entity comes into play. It gives you the ability to create what we call entity adapters. And these adapters know just enough about your entity state to give you helper functions for managing it. To create an adapter, by default, it's looking for the ID property on an entity. And it assumes that you want to maintain the sort order from your REST API. But it lets you override certain aspects of it. For instance, if you have a different key that you're using to determine which ones, or determine the ID of it. It also allows you to supply your own sort comparer. So if you don't want to maintain the same sort order that your API gave you, and you maybe want to sort all your items by, say, their name property, you can provide a sort comparer function.
What about performance? I love performance.
Right. We don't want to resort the entire collection every time we change the state shape. That would be incredibly slow to do. So NgRx entity is really smart about using this sort comparer function. It uses it when making insertions so that we can insert your item into the right place into the collection. That means we're not resorting your entire collection every time it changes. We're only doing it when we absolutely have to. This keeps your application running very fast. The adapter also comes with a number of functions that help you set up your reducer. For instance, we can use the adapter to initialize the state of the reducer. When it comes to updating the state, it comes with a number of functions for managing those. It handles all of the common use cases, like inserting into the collection, updating items in the collection, removing items, and lastly, upserting. It can also generate your selectors for you. So you don't have to write these selectors that go and grab these properties. We know what the state shape is, and we can generate them for you unique to your reducer. And they support all those use cases we laid out at the beginning. Using these selectors, you can query for one using select entities. You can get the entire list that we've restored for you with select all, and you can get the size of the collection.
Mike, can we see some code?
Yes. I'll show you how to use NgRx entity. And I'm going to give you a warning. I do not have the magical ability like Brandon does to just generate code.
What?
So I'm going to be a little bit slower.
I typed 3 letters and you saw all that code generated. You can't do that?
I can't do that.
Hey.
You're going to have to watch me do this, but
I need you to get good.
It's fine. This is what it's like working with him.
Don't be salty, Mike.
Speaking of being salty, I'm going to go ahead and update this action type right now. Let's see, this is from the user's API.
Is that good action hygiene?
This is good action hygiene.
Great.
And let's say we're doing a get all action.
We should put this in the app, in the generate function itself. That would be great.
So in the constructor, I'm going to let you specify that you can pass in this action, a list of users. And what I want to do is I want to be able to store this in a reducer function. So if I go back and look at this reducer function, it doesn't really have anything in it. NgRx semantics has scaffolded out the state and the initial state along with the reducer. But we want to actually implement this using NgRx entity. So the first thing I'm going to import is create entity adapter from NgRx entity. And this create adapter is how we are going to tell NgRx entity what our state shape or what our entities look like. So I'm going to create an adapter, and I'm going to do it using the user model.
Ooh, that nice type safety.
So the first thing I have to do is I have to select or tell NgRx entity how to select the ID out of this model. So to do that, I'm going to take a given user and I'm going to say you can get it using the ID. I'm also want to specify that I want these users to be supported or to be sorted by their name. So for user A and user B, you can compare them using their name. And I'm going to use the locale compare function on strings to write this quickly.
Fancy.
For the state interface, I don't actually have to type this out anymore. I can go ahead and delete this, and I can instead export a type called state and say that this is just entity state, imported from NgRx entity, and it maintains my user models. TypeScript's telling me my initial state's not fully implemented, and he's right. I'm going to use the adapter to quickly generate the initial state. Now, for my reducer function, all I have to do is add all of these users to my state. And to do that, I'm going to first delete this line of code, and I'm going to return adapter, add all, and I can get into my action and grab that user's property. Last thing I have to pass in is my state, and that's all there was to it to maintaining this collection.
That looks like a lot less code than that boilerplate you talked about earlier.
I'm blocking you.
I block you, you don't block me.
Last thing I need to do is I need to get those selectors. And NgRx entity is going to generate fast memoized selectors that work with this collection for me. So I'm going to say, give me the select IDs, select entities, select all, and select total.
You did a lot of typing.
But it was so much fewer lines of code to actually maintain a collection of users than the previous example. And this gets you moving so much faster because I've found that in an NgRx application, you write a lot of these types of reducers.
And that's totally okay.
All right, so let's jump back to it.
So now that we've covered using schematics to reduce boilerplate, and we talked about entity to manage collections, let's talk about what's happening in the future of NgRx.
So the biggest change that's going to really help you when writing less boilerplate is TypeScript 2.8. I've been told that Angular is going to get support for it with Angular 6.1. And what TypeScript 2.8 provides is it provides much better type utilities for us to infer the structure of your application. So if you've ever had to string up a large union of action classes before, that kind of thing is going to go away when TypeScript 2.8 lands in the Angular ecosystem.
And I don't know about you, but I love the CLI and I love schematics. So in the future versions of NgRx, we're going to provide further integration with the CLI by taking advantage of ng-add to add projects and automatically wire things up further, and also ng-update if you're migrating from one version of NgRx to the next.
If you saw the keynote yesterday, Brad Green announced that NgRx data is becoming an official part of the NgRx family. And NgRx data is a library by John Papa and Ward Bell, who will also be joining us and helping try to build conventions around NgRx.
So let's recap. We talked about explicitness that gives you type safety, serialization, and easier testing story.
We defined boilerplate.
Boilerplate.
Actions and reducers are not boilerplate, but connecting all these things up really is.
And that is because of the concepts that we mentioned earlier. By using these actions and types, it lets you that type safety flow throughout your app.
We also talked about how this kind of state management gives you things that you should really appreciate about NgRx, like immutability and serializability.
We also covered the things that hopefully will give you a good direction of what belongs in the store and what doesn't, so that you can write less code and still be productive.
So with that, we're going to go ahead and hand it over to Ward Bell, who's going to come up and give you a quick brief look into NgRx data. Thank you.
Stickers, we have stickers, so come get a sticker.
I got mine. All righty. Hey, look at that. All right. So 100% marketing slides all the time. That's what we want. That's what we get. So we're going to introduce you to, reactive style with NgRx. I'm Ward Bell. That's John Papa, and together we took this project on. Now, as you've learned through the Sherry principle, NgRx is really for shared state, and there's various kinds of shared state. There's entity state, those heroes and villains, and the customers and orders and products that you're used to saving. And then there's transient state, which is the user info, the preferences, and these are all the kinds of things that you would use NgRx data to manage. And then there's this local component state, which you do not put in NgRx, so we're in total alignment about that, all right? But as you begin to build this stuff out, it seems pretty easy to do the transient state, but when you start working with entity state, which is where I really want to focus, you find that you've got these artifacts that keep coming up that people have been talking about. So if we did one for, here's a project for just 2 heroes and villains in one of our examples, and you got a lot of files there, and you had to write them, and you have to do it again. Not all, every one of them, but a lot of them for each new entity type you add. And if you've only got 2, it's not so bad. And if you've got 50, it starts to look bad. And if you have an enterprise application with 300 entities, it's looking real bad. At least it was looking real bad for me. So we said, what can we do about it? Notice, by the way, yes, I totally agree with the definition of boilerplate being the... which is boilerplate should really be the stuff that you don't really touch. But when it all looks the same and you can't really tell what's different, then I call that boilerplate. So this, I'm going to get it. So, my good friend Brandon is going to kill me. So anyway, NgRx data is for entity state. It's not a replacement for all the kind of state that you're going to manage. It's not a replacement for anything, as you'll see. It's just a way. And it's a goal. And let me just show you what you've seen all the other stuff. Now let me just show you what it's like, the NgRx data experience. Like here, I got an entity model with 2 things. Let's assume it's really simple. I'm just going to define metadata for hero, as you can see how hard that is, and villain, you can see how hard that is. And if I had another one, guess what I do? Yeah. All right, and now I got to configure the NgRx data module, and that's what I do. I'm done. It's hard. I'll call it entity store module, so I have something separate from the other kinds of NgRx data things I'm doing. And now in my app store module, where I'm registering all my store stuff and doing all of my other NgRx stuff, I do that. So now there's all my entities that are ever going to be. Whether it's 2, 4, 50, 100, 300. And now for each one, I like to make a convenience service method to manage the interaction with the thing that NgRx data provides called an entity service factory, because there's implicitly an entity service for each entity type. You'll see how that works. And it's often the case that you'll customize this, so I happen to like a convenience method. And then I can inject that into my component that needs access to heroes. And I just say, hey, service, give me my selectors. And there they are. So I've got a heroes selector that's priming showing up on the list. And I got my loadings for my spinner. And then when I want to do any of my CRUD operations, I go like that. And you're done. Currently, I can't count because that said 2, but there were 5 steps there, friends. And you are done. All right, done is in quotes because you've really just begun, but you are up and running, talking to your back end even. You notice I didn't even build a REST service. So what did we see? There are no the thing on the right there is that original list. The thing on the left is what the store looks like, the store folder looks like when it's an eye chart, and it's supposed to be, don't try and read it too closely. The key is that the thing on the left does not grow. No matter how many entities you put in there, it doesn't have to grow. So there are no actions or action creators to write, there are no reducers to write, there are no selectors to write, there are no effects to write, there's no code generation involved. Some people ask me, can I help you write a schematics for NgRx data? If you have to write a schematics for NgRx data, then we failed. all right? Because the idea, this is not an argument against schematics. It's an argument about what the intention of NgRx data is, which is to say, a lot of these things are similar, there's a lot of the same patterns, so if you can follow the same patterns, we'll create these things, these artifacts, for you on the fly. You won't have to write them. They're there, all right? By the way, there's a built-in HTTP CRUD service. They're there. It's still NgRx. This is not an alternative to NgRx. This is saying if you follow conventions, we can do a lot of the things that you would do by hand ourselves for you on the fly, all right? So just to make the point, NgRx is built on NgRx store. That's the foundation. You get your stores, your actions, reducers, your selectors, they're all there. It uses effects to handle the HTTP stuff and to sort of act as a message bus. So when you say you want to go get something or save things or update, it's using the effects to hear that action, produce a call, comes back, takes the data, turns that into actions, they flow through the store. It's all there. We're using effects. NgRx entity, which you learned about today, is a fantastic representation of an entity collection. We loved it. We wrote our own. We saw NgRx entity. We said, no. These guys got it nailed. So put it in there. So we're riding on all of these things. All we're doing is adding something, another layer, optional, that if you have conventions for entity collections, you can use it, and then you just go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And by the way, you can tell, right? So one of the things with conventions, you've got to see what's going on. So the Redux store is there. If I don't know if I've still got this zoomy thing, but if you look in there, you can see I've got generating little methods and little store entries and stuff like that. Actions, and I'm generating the action titles for you. Each action is independent. Each has its own type, just like it's supposed to. So you can find what you're doing. And we know that we can't get it right. Like, my conventions are not your conventions, and you might have some entity, most of them 80% flow down the convention path, but something doesn't. So maybe, you don't call the primary key of your entity ID, you call it key or foo. Well, you can change that. That's, by the way, something that comes to you through NgRx entity. Say you don't like the way we did our REST service. You have your own custom data access service. You can change it at the individual collection item, like the collection for heroes. You can do it at the overall. You can just change the one that we're using. Change it. Custom actions. You've got extra things you want to do. Add them. And you can add your own reducers. There's meta reducers. You've got custom reducers. You want to completely change the way the reducers work for a particular entity. You can change it on an entity level, or you can change the default one. Or you can say, I like your default one, but I don't like the way you did the add to cache. So no problem, just change that one. And then all the others get it. Custom effects. You don't like effects at all? Don't use them. Yank it out. You do like effects, but you want to add your own? Add your own. You think a particular entity type is just like a bad fit for this thing? All right, you want to roll it yourself right from any of the other things that Brandon and Mike showed you? No problem. You don't have to throw every entity into this thing. Just pull it out, all right? This thing is not meant to be handcuffs. This is meant to liberate you to get going, see how far it takes you, customize where you need to, and step back and use standard NgRx when you need to. It's just NgRx. So we're really pleased that the team at NgRx thought they welcomed us into their family, so it's now a full house. We don't know who else is coming in there now. And like I say, who's the boss? Who's the boss? You're the boss. It's your NgRx. Thank you very much.